Thank you for your speech, Philip. Philip will now take questions. Again, the usual rules. Please put your hand up if you want to ask a question. Tell us your name and the organisation for which you work. And I'm going to start off by asking a really, really cynical question, born out of 30 years of covering politics. The case for reform, and many of the same reforms, has been made over and over by people over the years, politicians, people like Ken Henry, the former Treasury head, academics, business, now you, including some of the same issues, population plan, Ken Henry raised road user charges, and bipartisanship seems to be a ship that sailed away a very long time ago. What do you think it will take for the nation's politicians to pick up some of these big reform challenges and actually enact them?
So I think many countries respond to crisis by reforming. We've had 26 years of economic growth, and I think many of us, or most of us, would want that to continue. So what we try to do through our role of influence is provide evidence, A, around the need for reform, and then identify a pathway for reform as well, which is very much represented in the papers that we've been putting out. So give government as much as you can in terms of how to approach some of these reforms, why it's important, what it means to the taxpayer and the users. I think that's a good contribution, but back to my remarks, I think governments can't do it on their own, and they need to be, I think, engaged particularly by big business in terms of backing in some of these reforms and giving them confidence that these are good things to do.
Thank you. And questions? Just one down here and then one up the back.
Thanks. Hi Phil, Adrian from AECOM. Congratulations, well done on the 3-year tenure. I was going to ask you how many episodes of Utopia have played out in your boardroom, but I might not ask that one. Road user pricing has been talked about for a while, and it was mentioned by the Deputy Prime Minister, and it's always discussed as a good idea but politically fraught. Just in terms of that reform conversation, have you got thoughts on the baby steps we could make along the pathway? And I know I've talked to jurisdictions about running pilots, or just little things we can do to get people used to the idea before it's rolled out as potentially a national initiative.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. I think absolutely it needs baby steps. These things are challenging. The first step is to understand what the problem is we're trying to solve and to clearly articulate that. And the second step then is to explain that to the community and engage people in, look, this is the problem. And from our lens perspective, the problem is a funding problem. That's the most immediate problem. And the opportunity is the uptake in electric vehicles. So, if you play that fully out, fuel excise won't exist one day because there won't be any fossil fuels burned in the engine. So, that clearly needs some kind of reform. So that seems an obvious path to explore. But I think you need to explain to the community, hey, there's a problem here, and actually we're collecting less money now than we need to maintain our roads in the kind of condition you would expect. So step one, problem. Step two, talk to the community. And then once you've done that, you can think about what the options are.
And question up the back.
Hi, Phil, Megan from Consult Australia. We heard earlier about the need to be thinking long term. The issue of high-speed rail has been a very long and ongoing subject in Australia, and AECOM have done the study. It appears that we don't have the patronage to justify the project build just now, but has the business case been done with regards to protecting the corridor now, i.e. buying up the land required and having that as a bipartisan supported policy from governments to decide on the corridor and buy it now, and what the cost benefit would be of that happening now rather than at a later point in time?
Thanks for the question. To my understanding, there's no business case being done for preserving the corridor. We, as part of our corridor work, did our own modelling of a number of corridors, because we identified a number of corridors we thought were priorities to be preserved on this priority list. One of them was the East Coast High-Speed Rail Corridor. And from our modelling, we think if that was preserved, that would save the taxpayer about $3.5 billion. Already there's developments south of Sydney in that corridor that was identified a few years ago. So corridor preservation is really important. We need to encourage governments to do that. I'm pleased to say there's, and that was one of the things in my remarks I mentioned, there's been an improvement. We've going back to corridor preservation, which we absolutely need to, but not the high-speed rail one yet.
It reminds me, I did once ask Anthony Albanese in an interview several years ago whether either Sydney's second airport or high-speed rail would be delivered in our lifetimes. We've got the second airport. I'm not so confident about high-speed rail. And another question down here.
Philip, Steve Harrison from the City of Adelaide. When you talk about long-term future, I recently was reading that Uber and Airbus in France are saying within 5 years they will have affordable autonomous flying vehicles available, and they think, and some commentators think that this sort of phenomenon will take off, pardon the pun, with the same speed that mobile phones has. But are we actually seriously looking at this sort of impact that it may have on our cities? I know the Federal Aviation Authority in the US are actually looking at the implications of the impact in their cities, but are we looking at this in Australia?
I'm not aware around the autonomous flying vehicles, but there is work going on in various jurisdictions looking at autonomous vehicles, and the NTC's been also looking at that, the National Transport Commission. So there is work going on in the background thinking about this. I think that the really interesting question with some of this convergence of technology is who the regulators are going to be, and I think it's important we learn from some of the technological changes in the past to make sure we don't get in the way of some of this technology from a regulatory point of view, but equally make sure we're looking after users and taxpayers along the way.
Any more questions? I'll ask another one, a follow-up. Give people time to think of any more questions if they have one. You talked about taking kind of smaller steps on the way to road user charges. Is it possible to consider something like a congestion charge in major cities as a small step on the way to a general road user charge, and maybe something that will address some of the inequities that, say, the Nationals might feel with people in rural areas who drive much longer distances?
Yeah, I think people talk about congestion charging a lot, and I think that solves a particular problem, which is generally congestion in a cordoned area, which is generally a city centre or CBD. I'm not sure that's the problem we're trying to solve, and I think it is a bit of a distraction from the bigger problem, which is certainly a funding issue more broadly, where there is an equity problem.
Michael Trail, Good Start Early Learning. Just a question about the nature of the role of Infrastructure Australia. I mean, it seems to me that you've been very granular and disciplined in terms of mounting the case for thoughtful prioritisation of infrastructure, but there is a pretty brutal reality that you're government funded. I'm just interested in your perceptions as you step down from your role. Are there precedents globally, and I'm thinking particularly, I know the Pew Foundation in the US has been really quite an effective advocate, independently funded for the sort of things that I know you would feel strongly about. Is first prize to have a funded independent advocacy of this, if that was an option in Australia? I'm not in any way suggesting you've been other than effective, but as you look around the world, if the outcome we want is to force governments to be accountable and disciplined, what's the best way of doing that?
Well, I think it comes back to what's the problem we've got. So the way this priority list has been assembled is in an independent way from an evidence base with the collaboration of state and territory governments. I think that's a really fantastic step forward. The problem comes down to the funding, and as long as the funding is in negotiation between the federal government and the state governments, I think we've got a challenge, and you know, is partially one of the ways in which tax flows back from the federal government to state governments. As long as that's the mechanism, I think this is going to be challenging. But you know, the federal government in their budget announcements in May 85% of their infrastructure announcements came from this list. Now, there's a good bit and a bad bit to that. The good bit is 85% of the announcements came from the list, which means they committed to solving the problems in the list, but not all of these are fully defined projects yet. And I think that's where the challenge comes that I spoke about in my remarks, that by committing to solving all the problems, it's signalling that, yeah, we're going to solve that problem and you just bring forward a solution. Well, that might not be the best solution and the most cost-effective solution. So I think there's a way to go, but this is a journey, and I think it's complex with 3 levels of government, and I think that the next stage is actually doing something about the funding and having greater surety, if you will, around how you're going to redistribute the funding and what's available, and then maybe thinking about different mechanisms for redistributing that based on some good process.
If there are no more questions, I might ask one final one on the question of the population plan. What would be the ultimate aim? Is it to have federal, state and local government start planning for the really long term, start having a look at where the population flows are going and saying, okay, in 30 to 50 years' time, this is what we're going to need to have?
Yeah, I think we've got population forecasts from the ABS, and we certainly use those in our planning work. So we know what the forecasts are, but if you look at where that growth is, it's very much in 4 major capital cities, and I think we're missing a trick, and certainly that was discussed in the previous panel, that what's the opportunity to grow the population in Hobart or Adelaide or Canberra or Darwin or Broome, and what do we need to do to create the jobs there? And some of those cities have really great infrastructure already. It's just about the jobs and attracting people there, and I think that's part of the opportunity. Take some of the pressure off Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane and Perth, well, particularly at the moment Sydney and Melbourne. So it needs a joined up conversation looking to the long term, and I think the states, from our conversations, the states would welcome that.
Can we see one day when New South Wales and Victoria will fund a move to Canberra or Hobart campaign?
Depends what the incentives are.
Would you please thank Philip Davies?